obviously one of the big points in your career has been CIA, and I guess that everyone that you're talking to has been asking you about that, and being interested in that, which is you know perfectly reasonable. So I would also love to ask you a few questions about that because I find it very fascinating as well. Um, I'm interested to hear, like, what was the decision-making process in your head when this opportunity was presented to you? Like, this is such a big thing, something that is almost sacralistic in people's heads. So I'm just, very interested to hear, like, how do you approach something like that?
Well, I had applied for an internship at CIA when I was
Mhm,
in college,
mhm.
and I didn't get in. And so actually when this opportunity came along several years later, I mean, it just sort of seemed like a no-brainer, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you got to try it.
Yeah.
I knew I was interested in national security again, and I knew I was interested in international affairs. I spoke a bunch of languages, and so yeah, you don't try it, right? You
Yeah.
don't say no when an opportunity comes along, and if it's terrible, you can leave.
Yeah.
Um, there wasn't actually a whole lot more, sort of deep, complex thought that went
Mhm.
into it. I wasn't very happy with what I was doing, and this opportunity came along, and so I jumped and I tried, and I did it for a few years, and there were a lot of parts about it that I really liked. And there were other parts about it that I didn't like at all. And, and to the point where, 6 years later, I said, basta, and I left.
Yeah, I see. Like, you know, how was the actual experience in opposed to your expectations, if you have any? Like, because I assume everyone, is thinking about working for CIA in one way, but in reality might be different. So how was that for you?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that I wrote Victor and the Rebel.
Oh, really?
I find that sort of out in the real world, there is a great misunderstanding of what goes on at CIA.
Yeah.
And pop culture is very entertaining,
Mhm.
but it's just very far removed from the truth.
Yeah.
And so and I don't know that I went in there with such great expectations that I was going to get an invisible car or something, um but you really do hear these sort of legendary stories about CIA.
Yeah.
And when I got in, what I found actually, it's a very big organization. It's very bureaucratic. I was there at a strange time because I joined in early 2003. So just shortly after 9/11 and just before we went into Iraq. And so there were a lot of changes that were going on internally, which added to the administration and the bureaucracy. And so that part was frustrating and was much more like The Office. Like the TV show The Office,
Yeah.
rather than some like Mission Impossible or something. So that itself was eye opening. But I will say the substance was fascinating. I mean, I met really interesting people. I met some not interesting people too, like you would in any big organization, but I met some really interesting people. I met some very smart people. And there are some very cool operations that take place, and I was lucky enough to to help with those or support those, or even just see some of them from afar. But so it was a fun and interesting thing to be involved in. But I just find, yeah, that this public perception of what the agency is, what it's capable of, the notion that it goes rogue and it sort of does all these things without oversight. I mean, the number of lawyers at that place, and they just have a template that says no. They can just hit F9, and the no cable will come out. So this, again, I just think a lot of what the general public thinks about it is probably wrong. Which is why I write some of the things that I write, because it's much more complex and nuanced than that. And I think it's good, especially in a democracy where we need transparency. A certain amount of transparency, even within the intelligence world, is important. It's important that we know and understand and have oversight over the things that they're doing to an extent, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you actually kind of touched on, on my next question, because I have always been wondering about, the little details when it comes to working in such secretive and mythological even places, in terms of, was the working environment there? Like, do people over there talk and socialize in a normal manner, or is it just something, completely different thing? So it's very interesting to hear that perspective in terms of, what's actually happening.
I'll just say on that, actually, sorry. So
Yeah.
socially, I actually found this, like, from an anthropological point of view or something, very interesting, because so much of your life when you're working in the intelligence world is shut off from the outside, right? You can't share it with others. There really is an enormous and incredible camaraderie inside, because these are the only people that you can share those things with. And these are the only people who can understand what stresses you're under or what risks you've taken and that kind of thing. These are the only people with whom you can discuss that. And so it's actually, it's a quite nice camaraderie in many ways.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. I was imagining it in this way because, and this was another thing I wanted to ask in terms of when you're being committed to such a, such a big thing, such a big process with so many different people, with such a big mission. How does that affect your life, like your personal life? Like, can you actually live a normal daily routine when you're committed to that, or does it hinder it in some way?
Well, what is a normal daily routine?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I guess a trivial daily routine,
I mean, I had a normal daily routine, but it was probably different than, a lot of others. I guess more in terms of like personal relationships, I think a lot of people have asked me about, a lot of people marry inside the agency. I mean, I do know stories of people, single people in the agency going on dates with people outside the agency, and each of them sort of taking a different approach about at what point do I share what?
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, that can be very hard. And then the living overseas part, also is its own culture. Somebody actually, Jason Matthews, who wrote the Red Sparrow books, he was my boss at one point, and he said to me, working at CIA is not a job; it is a lifestyle. And I think that he's right on that, because when the other part of this is, when you're overseas, and I would say that this goes also with, for foreign service officers at State Department, or, anybody who's sort of working overseas for the government. You really need the whole family to be brought into it. Everybody has to buy in to what you're doing, because it now becomes your life, and everybody is involved. That's not just because there are situations where you're running an operation where your family might be on the support side of it. It may be that you're going out with somebody and your spouse has to go along with it. Or it may just be, like you said, you have a crazy schedule and you're out super late at night doing things that don't necessarily make sense to your spouse, but your spouse has to understand it and support it. And so, everybody plays a role in that. And so, and you're moving all of the time. So that's it. Everybody really has to buy into it and be part of it, I think, in order for the employee really to be successful.
This makes all the sense. It sounds as such a, at least when I hear about this sort of, occupations, I just perceive it as a very mentally and physically demanding thing, that requires a lot of commitment and a lot of dedication. So I'm just interested to hear how it actually reflects on people when you do it to a full extent. So, you actually touched on that briefly, but and I don't know if you can talk about that in a detailed manner or not, but I would be just interested to hear your general thoughts in general. But like, what would you say is like the best and most enjoyable part of working such a job, and the worst / the most challenging one?
I think the most interesting part is that you're given a lot of responsibility very early on, even sort of new people coming into the agency. You get responsibility for big deal things pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And of course you're interested, you're working on interesting topics, right? Working on national security issues that have a direct effect on policy. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. And again, the people that you're working with are, tend to be really interesting as well. Both the analysts who are the smartest people on earth ever that I've ever met, but also the operators, because they're crazy and they're always thinking of really creative ways of going out to get whatever it is that you need to get. Yeah. And so you're really surrounded by interesting people. But again, then some of those challenges are, come back to some of the challenges, personally of how you balance all of these sort of strange things and lying to the people around you. But then there are also challenges, particularly I think at CIA, that you do not make policy. So, and again, just because of the time when I was there, we had these examples where you could give all this information, good information, to the policymakers, but you can't help what they do with it. Or don't do with it, So you can lead a policymaker to the intel, but you can't make them read. So that was frustrating because you could see, we knew we were on the ground. We knew certain things that were happening. We knew what consequences would be, and then you see the policy come down, and you say, "Well, okay, I mean, that's their prerogative to make that policy, but now we also know what all the consequences will be."